Okay, something a little bit different today. I think I had mentioned this last week that I was considering doing this, and I went ahead to do this. I went ahead and did this. We'll continue where we left off in Proverbs next week, but I wanted to widen a little bit this theme of where the book of Proverbs comes from a cultural, contextual point of view in the greater tradition of the ancient Near East wisdom literature. And and then I thought maybe we'd also go not just backwards but forwards. What happened in the Jewish literary tradition after the book of Proverbs? And this, of course, is not comprehensive in any way. These are just examples. Just and so we'll be moving from about the 20th century BCE to the third century CE, third century CE. And of course, we could have done much more. For those that are just joining us, I'm just giving a brief introduction. You haven't missed anything. Um, so wisdom literature is different than, say, halachic literature usually. Wisdom is has to do with how you live your life, manners or etiquette, and in this particular case today, table etiquette, as opposed to halacha, which is bare bones, exactly what you do, what's permissible and what is forbidden. Now we're going to see those two converge. I brought an example of that afterwards. In rabbinic literature, so in biblical literature, we've spoken before, but it's a good time other people have joined this group since we began. Wisdom literature is found in books like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes. Kohelet is found in very frontal form. It presents itself as wisdom literature. It's secondary, perhaps, in prophetic literature. There, of course, is wisdom and things said throughout the different prophets. There is in the philosophical writings, or perhaps it's just a different form of wisdom literature, is the book of Job. It has a narrative framework, just the first and the beginning and the end of the book, but the middle part, the greater part of the book, is in these conversations that are a different form of wisdom literature. There are psalms that are wisdom psalms, um, and not really my expertise. As I shared with you before, this is the first time I'm actually teaching something which is wisdom literature par excellence. In rabbinic literature, we have Pirkei Avot, chapters of the fathers, which is a good example, except for you have bits of wisdom literature, I would imagine, through the Mishnah. I haven't taken that, looked into it in different places, but certainly have it all over the Talmud. Oh, we've got that echo thing going again. All right, I don't know what to do. Madalena, I see. Um,
I think I'll mute some people.
Still, that shouldn't happen though. Yeah. Yeah, but I need people to be able to speak freely though. So,
Rabbi, I'm not hearing any echo now, right now from you. I heard like a millisecond of a,
yeah. So I'm not.
I don't
I'm
hear
wondering
anything
why
either.
that's happening. That's not supposed to happen either. It's distracting. All right, we'll continue, and Madalena, you'll tell us if you want to start over or something. I'm signed in on the Or Bar account. In the past, we've tried signing in. If you want me to go out and come in through David Lazar, let me know. Yeah, I hear an echo now. Um,
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, and there's no echo.
I don't hear an echo.
Okay.
I don't hear anything either.
All right, then
Perhaps
is it
just try to keep your microphone muted while you're not speaking, but unmute whenever you need to speak.
okay?
Not you, Ravi. I mean,
I understand. I understand.
Okay.
Okay. So all throughout the Talmud, there's wisdom literature, and then once again in medieval commentaries, there's lots of wisdom that's found, wisdom as opposed to halacha. etiquette is, which is not exactly, yes or no, forbidden and permissible, although there's an overlap as we see. And then you have, I would say, what's parallel to wisdom literature in the late medieval or early modern times is what we know as Musar literature, ethics literature. Um, or yeah. And then of course, Jewish self-help books today would be an example of Jewish wisdom literature. Okay, let's go over again what we did. I brought the two bookends of a section from last week that talk about eating and use the root lamed chet mem lechem, and with some other verbs. So if I could ask Megan, why don't you, first of all, welcome back. It's good to have you after not being around. You've made your move from the East Coast back to the West Coast. So welcome. Oh, you're back in the East Coast now?
Nope, I'm
Oh.
back on the West Coast. Hopefully
Good.
not to do it again. It's
Oh.
hard moving. Yeah.
Okay,
So it's
good to have
be
you here.
Good to be here.
So please go ahead and do for us this section in Proverbs from chapter 23.
Okay. When you sit down to dine with a ruler, consider well who is before you. Thrust a knife into your gullet if you have a large appetite. Do not crave the dainties, for they are counterfeit food. Do not eat of a miser's food. Do not crave for his dainties. He is like one keeping accounts. Eat and drink, he says to you, but he does not really mean it. The morsel you eat, you will vomit. You will waste your courteous words.
Okay, so this goes in and out between simple language and metaphorical language. I don't think there's obviously not any kind of advice to stab oneself in the throat or actually to vomit, although we'll see there is advice to vomit in other places. Um, and and yet it does talk about one of the things that popped up to me that we didn't really talk about last time, but I like it, is these counterfeit food, lechem ksevim, counterfeit food. Like what would be counterfeit food today?
Ultra processed food.
Either, so, Fritos, Cheetos, maybe we could argue over popcorn, but yeah, super processed foods and things that fill us up carbs that we yearn for, and that maybe in some cases are needed, for, people that are active in sports and things like that need to have carbs at different points. But this idea that everything that's in front of us that we put through our mouths or we digest is really food, some of it is fake. Yes, Les.
Is the writer or writers trying to differentiate between a ruler and the miser, or is he sort of, he or she comparing them as being equally difficult? I'm trying to understand is for the ruler, I mean, you don't want to crave the dainties, but it seems to be saying fill your appetite, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, let's remember there's verses in between this as well that
Okay.
we skipped over that has to do with other things. I just brought these because they focus on the food issue.
Okay.
And also, let's remember that in Proverbs, there are often independent messages, one line next to another. The reason that the section was grouped together last week, and this is an excerpt from that, is because they parallel, as next week as well, we're going forward, they parallel the ancient Egyptian wisdom literature that we have, some of it. And it's really easy to see how it's a Hebrew take or Israelite take on the ancient Egyptian tradition, but not each paragraph necessarily relates to another. So I'm not sure we could jump to that conclusion. It's just different examples of eating and keeping in mind who you're sitting at the table with. Yeah. And that maybe we'll set that aside and look at that in each of the pieces that we look going forward. So So Megan, if you would read, if you'd read the next portion, the next portion is, um, we had some question about what comes first in last week's the Egyptian the wisdom of the tradition that we brought, which was relatively late in their tradition. The version that we have here's something that everybody agrees is early. There's so this is an interesting. This is a papyrus, right? Papyrus. It's made out of papyrus that we see here. Whatever. They stitch it, not stitch it, but they make it with strips that intertwine with each other, kind of a basket kind of thing. It's dried, and that's the first kind of paper, at least in our part of the world. And it's written on in ink. It was discovered in the grave of a pharaoh who lived in the 16th century BCE. So we know the text is at least that old. In Egyptian archaeology and history, it's amazing that they have so much, they're able to be so exact with dates. I guess there's so much converging literature and things, but where we in the biblical literature, we don't really know much before 1000, 1100 BCE to really give dates. Also, we don't know how historical things are. Here we know one thing. We know that there's a grave of a pharaoh who lived in the 16th century BCE, and in his grave was found this papyrus. It's called the Prise. I don't know how to pronounce it in French. It's a French name, papyrus, because this guy, this French archaeologist, was there in Egypt in 1847. It was first published in 1847, but so in the 19th century, he's in Egypt. As many European countries did, just raping the country for all of its antiquities and things like that. And in the tradition that I saw says that he was given this papyrus by locals in that particular village, whether he was given, whatever it is. Brought it back to France, first published in 1847. This is a much newer translation because language changed. Whereas somebody asked about the language last year, and last week, and we assumed it was hieroglyphics. Maybe that was, but this is in something called Hieratic. So hieratic, which is cursive script, and it's written and traditionally written ink and ink on papyrus. Okay, so I think that's what we have to say. Now, it can't be later than that because that's a grave it was found in. All right. How early does it go? Well, that depends on other texts that it's compared with, and it purports to be from a very early period, from the 26th to 25th century BCE. Right? It purports to be this instruction to Kagameni. I don't know how to pronounce his name properly. And we know when this particular vizier lived and whom he lived, Pharaoh Snerfu. But I think scholars are skeptical that it's that old. So what does it mean that it's not that old? It's only I forgot. I didn't make a note of what scholars' views of it. But in any case, we understand it's over 3,600 years old, whatever it is. Okay. Sorry for that long verby. Okay. So go ahead. Megan, you want to read this section as well?
Sure. If you are sitting with a glutton, you should eat only when his craving has passed. If you drink with a drunk, you should partake only when his heart is content. Do not pounce on the meat when sitting next to a greedy man. Take what he gives you, do not refuse it. This is the way to soothe he who is without reproach in regard to food. No word will prevail against him.
Right. So how to read that? This is to soothe. Is there a subject that it's not clear? There's a period in the publication of the text, so maybe it's just a way to soothe life. It's not how we use the word soothe, or maybe it does mean soothe the one who is without reproach. I don't think so. I think the last line stands on its own.
It
Um,
might be to soothe the gluttonous energy that's around this type of person,
mhm.
is not join in with it.
Okay, so what things come up here that are similar or reminiscent, or what things in Proverbs that we read are reminiscent of this or different?
Well, it's similar in what we just read, in that it's basically saying pay attention to who you're around, eating with before you partake.
Right. Right. You might be a greedy man. Be aware of if a person's a glutton. Um, what we don't have, and it feels like that we had another part of Proverbs that did talk about drinking with a drunk, but I don't know. That's not in our text, at least. Anything else?
Well, I have a sort of 20th, 21st century interpretation of this. Um, perhaps I feel like the advice they're giving is to how to walk on eggshells around people who live to excess.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And
Don't pounce on the meat, because if you're eating with somebody who's greedy or a glutton or a drunk, hold back. Just hold back, let them do their thing, and then you go in and partake as you will.
okay, others?
I don't know.
Well, I think it's about self-restraint.
As is much of the book of Proverbs, right?
Right. Right.
Now there's a little bit of a difference. So in Proverbs it said, um, do not eat of the miser's food at all. Do not crave the dainties, because he's one who's keeping accounts. By the way, for those that read the Hebrew, ki kamo sha'ar b'nafsho. We say in Hebrew today, mishe'er b'nafshi. This is a shin ayin resh, which is a hapax. It's the only time it's used in this way, and according to BDB, it's from a different root, a different shin ayin resh, as perhaps as maybe it's connected to, but the word gate shar. It's similar to those in the rabbinic Hebrew, shiur, not shiur as in lesson, but shiur as in measurement. Um, Elu hadvarim she'en shiur. These are the things for that there's no limit, having to do with charitable gifts and things like that. So this person's keeping account, and he says to you eat and drink, but he doesn't really mean it. If you look below in the section we read, is take what he gives you, do not refuse it, because you're going to get into trouble, right? And this idea of on one hand, and they're not mutually exclusive, but on one hand, to know who to refuse from, who to say, I'm not really hungry, thank you, and to know who say, oh, of course, thank you, I'm happy to partake of this, right? I think maybe the problem might be.
I think it might be Elise, because when she was muted, or when the noise came on, her frame lit up green. So something in her room there that squeaked.
I think so. So I've muted you, Eileen. I think it might be that. Don't take this personally. It's nothing to do with your character. There's nothing in the book of Proverbs around it, but let's try to see if that happens again when you unmute and then somebody speaks at the same time. Um, so back to this idea when to refuse food, when to accept food. The idea of, in some places, we know that if you're in someone's house and you don't eat the food, you know they will be offended, because perhaps they made food especially for you. It's happened to me many times in my life when people have said, "Well, I especially made something vegetarian for you or something kosher for you." One example, I've told the example about eating in the imam's house in Sweden. I won't do that again. But another one was I went to visit a woman who I knew in Taizé, who she put me up for, I was driving a longer distance and it was a horrible stormy night. I get to her house and she says, well, I cooked especially for you something because I know you eat kosher. I'm thinking to myself, this is like a little village near Dijon, right? In Burgundy, France. I said, where would she possibly get kosher meat? And besides, I'm saying to myself, and besides, I'm a vegetarian. And it's just, and I sat down and she had made a beef dish as opposed to pork because she knew that I must keep kosher because I'm a rabbi. I did not have the heart and the wherewithal to actually eat the beef, but I did eat the vegetables because I said, oh, and I said, oh, I'm a vegetarian. She said, oh, yes, I forgot you're a vegetarian. She says, but you can have the potatoes and the tomatoes that are in the stew, right? Yeah, of course, yeah. Now, is that kosher? That's not kosher by any stretch of the imagination, except for, yeah, that evening that was kosher. The other example is when the imam, for those that don't know the story, but the imam said that he ordered for me special halal. The special halal delivery didn't arrive, and I think to myself, what is special halal? Is that like glatt kosher, like special extra kosher, extra halal, or is that he doesn't know the word kosher, so that's his way of telling me that he ordered kosher meat, and it needed to be delivered. And of course, I didn't say I was a vegetarian. I didn't even think it would be lunchtime. I hadn't thought of that, and I ate it. I ate it because the decision I made right away is that not to I don't want somebody goes out of my way, especially from that tradition of Middle Eastern hospitality. It's a far greater sin in my mind. In my mind, it's a far greater sin against God to disrespect somebody in that way. So that's one example. So I find myself in the ancient Egyptian, take what he gives you, do not refuse it. I find myself there in that. But of course, other places, especially when it's sugar stuff and desserts, it would be. I know that people are watching me. I know people know that I have diabetes, so I know that our congregants, when I'm in people's house, I know I'm being watched as to what I eat. Um, and Richard knows that I'm watching him also.
I never
Okay.
watch what anybody else eats. I only watch what I eat,
Okay.
and it's
Um,
too much.
but think in terms of going out with people, and you don't know yet who's going to pay the bill. You want to pay the bill, but maybe they'll insist on pay the bill. Well, when we're with somebody and if we're paying the bill, then we'll order whatever we want. And I try to encourage others to do so. But that thing, do you get an appetizer? Do you get do you have two things? Do you get a drink? Do you get a cocktail? Whatever it is that might, push the bill up, depending on the situation. There's a lot of things to think about. And I don't know that we as rabbis in the liberal world spend enough time on these kinds of things. That's where I'm getting with this, right? In looking through internet possibilities for rabbinic wisdom, I found a huge amount from the Orthodox world, from the OU, the Union of Orthodox Jews, from Chabad, Aish Torah, a lot of things about table etiquette. And we'll get to the challenge of that in a second. But I'm wondering how much perhaps um, we should I should spend more time on these kinds of things, especially with young people. I did a lot when I was younger with sexual etiquette, let's call it that, right? Sexual ethics and things like that amongst the post-army kids in the conservative movement in Israel, because nobody else was doing that, and I felt that there should be some Jewish input into that. It's not about what you're allowed to do, not allowed to do. It's what are the issues that you think of when you want to be a good Masorti / conservative Jew and you're thinking about having sex or how you interact with somebody you have feelings for in a physical way. So this would, if I was doing it over again, this would be one that I would do as well. And I would start with the ancient wisdom and see where we go with it.
Getting back to table manners, do people, maybe especially young people, want to be told how to appropriately eat?
So let me go back to the analogy of sexual conduct and sexual ethics. I was never there ever to tell them how they should do things. My job was to raise the issues in a Jewish context, Jewish literary context. So for instance, I would have them fill out this. I'm not going to go into details, but it was talking about things. Can a one night stand ever be anything other than negative? I wanted them to have that conversation and to to reflect upon the Jewish literary sources for them to make up the mind for themselves. Is there okay? But I get there was opinion. I was willing to tell them what to do when it is violent, when it's abusive. That I felt that's my position to say. I think those are the things that you want to stay away from. But the conversation was empowering to them because I wasn't there to say what is forbidden, what is permissible. I was there to facilitate the conversation in the Jewish literary framework. And to me, that's what my allegiance, my loyalty to halacha is. It's not about mutar va'asur, permissible and forbidden. That's the difference between me and most conservative rabbis, certainly between Orthodox rabbis. But most conservative rabbis are still seem to be concerned with if I judge from what's in the discussion groups, both Facebook or another, well, I'm really only there now, is would you permit? Would you permit this in your synagogue? Would you not permit this in your synagogue? This whole business of who can marry and things like that. Um, I'm less. I'm not that kind of a rabbi. I'm the kind of a rabbi that looks into the halachic resources, and if it says one thing, I may be inspired to do exactly the opposite. But when I do the opposite, it's because I've gone through a process of seeing what has been done, what has been spoken about it for the last 2,000 years or more. And and I'm not saying my way is better, but it's a good way for me. And therefore, I don't face that challenge less of young people saying, "Who are you to tell me how to eat?" Right? Um, right. Of course, you probably had patients over the years that said, "Who are you to tell me how to eat?" Even though you're a doctor, right? Okay. Anything else on this? Okay, so if I don't know much about the ancient, I don't know hardly anything at all about the ancient Egyptian wisdom tradition, but it's nice to see an excerpt here and there, and other people have done the work for me. Uh, I do know a little bit more about Ben Sirah. I've not taught the text and not gone into depth, but it's something that we know in Jewish studies, and this is really a fascinating topic. Those that grew up, if anybody grew up in the Catholic tradition, or um, they know that part of the it's called the apocryphal literature, but it's the ancient pre-New Testament writing part of the Bible, of a Christian Bible, of a pre not a non-Protestant Bible. The Luther did away with those, but of the Catholic, I would imagine Orthodox Bibles as well. You have Sirachides or Sirachades or Ben Sirach, Sirach. There's different spellings. So this is a document. This is a book that was composed around 180 BCE. And unlike other and it almost got into the Hebrew canon. It was in the Alexandrian biblical or scriptural canon from the Alexandrian Jewish community, and hence it's included in the Septuagint. That's how it got to the church. Um, it's also called in Latin Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes. And some sorry distractions, mother's estate, business, things like that. Um, Phone call, ignoring. All right, apology done. Um, so Ben Sira, we know when it was written because the Greek version was translated by his grandson, and his grandson puts in a date. This never happens. Never happens in his preface to the book, and we have no reason not to assume that that's true, right? So scholars agree that it's 180, 180, something like 180 BCE is when the book was written. It has been done in the biblical tradition of wisdom, but it's a bit different. But then we only have the Greek or other languages, I think Armenian and Coptic, things like that, that were preserved in the various church traditions. Um, And then in the late 19th century, when the Cairo Gniza was being sifted through, and I think I've mentioned that before, this depository of old used books that you don't throw away in the Jewish tradition. In like a Torah scroll is buried in a cemetery, but other books you put them in a place, and then they're eventually brought to cemetery. Well, in Cairo, there was a place where it piled up for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then these two archaeologists that found the documents came back to Cambridge, and they showed that what they identified were Hebrew fragments or scrolls to a relatively young Solomon Schechter, who was the reader of rabbinic texts at, I think, at Cambridge, not at Oxford, Cambridge, who went on to become not the founder, but one of the founding figures of conservative Judaism, Solomon Schechter. Hence, you have Solomon Schechter schools and things like that in the United States. And Schechter was able to see the stories go right away. I don't know how right away, but was able to identify that it was a Hebrew version of what we only had in Greek for hundreds of years. For 2,000 years, it was only Greek. Everybody agreed it's a Jewish text. And so it turns out in the end they found another, I think, six sections, fragments of this book in the Cairo Geniza. And then afterwards in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found more fragments, far more or less text, but fragments of ancient Hebrew text, of a text that we know is Jewish, but we only had in Greek. So that excites me. Those kind of things, stories. That's really cool. I'd love to see the museum exhibit. I'm sure they've done it before, but someplace on the book of Ben Sirah. We call him Ben Sirah. You all sometimes say Jesus Ben Sirah because his name is Yoshua, and that was in Greek turned out to be the same what became in English Jesus. Nothing to do with Jesus Christ. Has a lot to do with Jewish tradition. So Ben Sirah is interesting. But it's confusing. It's hard to find there's a whole website devoted to it that has links to all the different facsimile editions or the different editions that have been published over the last 100 years or so or more of the Hebrew text, but it's hard to match it up exactly. I don't have a modern commentary of Ben Sirah. It wasn't my focus, so I wasn't able to dive deeper, but I did take, for our purposes today, the new revised standard version of Ben Sirah for us to take a look at, and it's thought as it's obviously it's newer, it's younger than the Book of Proverbs. That's obvious, right? It takes on that tradition, but also could be taking from earlier traditions from other places as well. But this is a much larger section about table etiquette. Okay, that's the long introduction to that. So Diane, would you like to read the section for Ben Sirah?
Okay, I'm muted. What's that? Okay, so read where it says 12.
Yeah, the
Okay.
title should be 31:12 to
Yeah,
24.
Ben Sirah 31:12 to 13.
Right, but it
Okay,
should be 24. Just correcting, that's a typo. Should be 12 to 24.
oh. Are you seated at the table of the great? Do not be greedy at it, and do not say how much food there is here. Remember that a greedy eye is a bad thing. What has been created more greedy than the eye? Therefore, it covers the face with tears. Do not reach out your hand for everything you see, and do not crowd your neighbor at the dish. Judge your neighbor's feelings by your own, and in every matter be thoughtful. Eat what is set before you like a well-brought-up person, and do not chew greedily, or you will be despised. Be the first to stop, as befits good manners, and do not be insatiable, or you will give offense. If you are seated among many persons, do not help yourself before they do. How ample a little is for the well-disciplined. They do not breathe heavily when in bed. Healthy sleep depends on moderate eating. They rise early and feel fit. The distress of sleeplessness and of nausea and colic are with the glutton. If you are overstuffed with food, get up to vomit and you will have relief. Listen to me, my child, and do not disregard me. And in the end, you will appreciate my words. In everything you do, be moderate, and no sickness will overtake you. People bless those who are liberal with food, and the testimony to their generosity is trustworthy. The city complains of those who are stingy with food, and the testimony to their stinginess is accurate.
Anybody want to chime in? Lots to talk about here. My first reflection in this is that, again, if I was doing it over and I was a younger rabbi working with youth, the whole challenge of what's the proper term? Eating. Sasha, Mazer. Bayot achila.
Etiquette?
Eating disorder, sorry. Eating disorder.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah,
I thought they're
bulimia.
advocating bulimia.
Yeah. So this is what I would frame, because it's not advocating, but there's that part there about the vomiting,
Right.
but there, it seems to be the section in entirety is important, which is why I let you read through the whole thing. It's because in the end, it's about finding a balance. And this would be great, I think, to use as discussion fodder for not only bulimia but also for other forms of disorders, and other forms of behavior, and they go both ways, right? I remember hearing once at another table in a airport lounge, some young men talking about going to Las Vegas to the all-you-can-eat places, buffets, and how they would go in, they would eat, and then they would go induce vomiting. So they go back and have some more. Like I never heard anything so ridiculous in my life. It's before I was exposed in general to that whole idea of bulimia and how that works. But I was anyway. So what else do we get? So what else?
That was also a Roman custom. It was very,
Okay.
so maybe they got this from the Romans. I don't know.
Yeah. Or
My concern is line 18. It's always a dilemma for me. Is that when you're in a group thing where it's like a buffet or a party or something, and they set out all the food, and no one wants to go to the table because no one wants to be first. So who should that be?
Yeah.
so you should have
I
some.
frequently volunteer, but am I doing something bad if I volunteer to be first?
So the answer to that is sometimes it's the rabbi. That is actually I've found that as an expectation in some situations, because it opens the door for others. But Richard, you remember, as I do, in a particular place whose name will not be mentioned, that when there was oneg or kiddush after the prayers, there were certain people that were always the first in line, and it's noticeable. In other words, if you're always the one who's first in line, or if you're the one who takes forever to pick at
Oh, I know those people too.
yeah.
Yeah.
So those are the things that I think we all want to be conscious that we don't fall into. And yeah.
Did Ben Sira have a medical background?
Sasha's asking if Ben Sira had a medical background. Well, wisdom literature, and so that's a good question, actually, Sasha, because medical issues in Talmudic literature they become halachic. You can do or cannot do, you should do, but they really come from the same area of wisdom literature.
I haven't written Rambam at length, but I think in Rambam there's a lot of medical advice.
Right. So Sasha's saying that in Maimonides there is, and indeed you're right. There's tremendous amount. If I was looking to do more than 2 pages here, if I was building a course out of this, Sasha, I would absolutely bring Rambam. Rambam, who had a medical background, does talk about a lot of these things. But I only went as far as the Tosefta today, which we'll get to in a second. So yeah, but that's over the overlap between halacha and wisdom literature is medical literature then before it became, as scientific as it is, I guess. I don't know. Les, you want to?
Well, I mean, I keep thinking it's both common sense and observational. And I don't think necessarily the medical profession is any more keen at identifying those unless they actually study something and get a answer that is not what is common sense or not what people normally think is the correct answer. Then I think that's the role through science and what theory and all that that the medical profession plays. But a lot of this sounds like, and I'm not saying this pejorative at all, it sounds like a mother's advice to her kids about, don't eat so fast, um, eat some more. Why aren't you eating more? You look like you're losing weight, things like that. So
Yeah, and wisdom literature, at least the book of Proverbs, and I would imagine in Ben Sira as well, I don't know, it has a lot is an overlap with how parents are raising their children, right? It's the wisdom that parents pass on.
but I think it's usually common sense.
Well,
And not that people have common sense, they often need to be told what they should know just from their experience. But
well, common sense is something though doesn't stand still, right?
well, I mean, most people know this stuff, but whether they actually practice it is another matter.
But did most people know this stuff 2,000 years ago? That's what I'm saying.
I think people knew that if you ate more beyond being satisfied, satiated, you often felt bloated and had colic and nausea, and had trouble sleeping. Had reflux at night. Whatever. Um, and yeah, it's observational, I think.
Okay.
I have a more general question about this because it seems like the Hebrew is more nuanced and has meaning that would be maybe more almost metaphorical about eating. Like the line, just I'm back on like the fourth line, in Baal Nefesh Atah. That seems like if you have life, how do they translate that into if you have a large appetite?
That's another question. That's a question about the Proverbs themselves. But yeah, and I think you're hearing the Hebrew through a modern Hebrew lens, not lens,
Okay.
filter, right? We have to be really careful with Hebrew because it's not just modern Hebrew versus biblical Hebrew. It's what period of biblical Hebrew are we talking about over 1,000 year span? The earliest of the Psalms as opposed to the latest of the book of Daniel, the Hebrew parts of Daniel, like that's 1,000 years at least. And then we have to consider rabbinic Hebrew, which is one thing that changes in medieval times. There's a rabbinic Hebrew of the time of the sages, of the Talmudic, more or less. I'm oversimplifying. And then there's medieval Hebrew, which is changed and had its own rules because nobody was speaking it anymore, and nobody was speaking Aramaic anymore, as opposed to. And then modern Hebrew, which is a synthetic thing. It's not an authentic language in itself. It's made up of biblical Hebrew plus rabbinic Hebrew, mostly Mishnaic Hebrew. So we have to be really careful as we understand. So nefesh has to do uh, with yearning as well, with yearning and with inclination. Yeah. So that's why Baal Nefesh, and in this context, um, the the NJPS translation, which I use here, usually does not have very many notes. Sometimes there's notes. Hebrew is unclear or emendation yields, those kind of things. But the Torah has a companion volume, which came out which was published by the well, Harold knows this. Harold and I talked about this a few years ago. By the editor in chief of the translation of the Torah in the '60s, Harry Orlinsky, and he has not on everything, but he has here and there explanations as to why they chose one word in English over another. That companion value, that's great. Any any serious modern commentary uh, will often chime in with their own translation and say why they've translated differently as well. I'd have to look on this particular one. I don't know, but from a biblical point of view, Baal Nefesh translated as a large appetite makes absolute sense to me. But I hear what you're
Okay.
saying. And it's good to be attentive to that. Now, every language has its nuances, right? And we should be, while we should be concerned with the Hebrew because it was written in Hebrew, that was kind of my explanation before. It's hard to find the parallel text. I did look through one of the early versions. I think Schechter published it of Ben Sirah, and I could not find these lines because it's a different text, and it's been passed over. So, in other words, it's not like we're all working from the same original. The best example of that is the book of Jeremiah in the Masoretic text. That's the Hebrew text that we've had for generations. It's been passed down. Is 3/8 longer than the Greek version. That's a huge amount of material. And so they were working with two different versions of the book of Jeremiah. One was pre-Babylonian exile, one was post, probably, maybe not, yeah, the editions have to do with Babylonia very often. But so it's super tricky as opposed to, I don't know, other books in which the Greek, the Hebrew, the ancient Syriac, all the different versions, they agree on more or less the same text. Yeah. Ben Sirah is not one of those situations. Okay. One thing that struck me here was the talk about the eye, explanation as to the greedy eye, right? Our eyes. What do you say in Hebrew? Einaim gdolot. What do we say when a child takes more? I think that's the expression in modern Hebrew is if a child takes too much on their plate from the buffet or orders too much, whatever, then they have big eyes, big eyes. So here is I like this idea that what's greedier than the eye, that therefore it covers the face with tears. It seems like he's going on into something else there, right? But this idea that eyes are greedy because they cover the face with tears, that be careful of your eyes. Yeah. It's certainly not seeing tears as something positive. I see them as very positive. But
How about the eyes are bigger than the stomach?
is that an expression in English?
Yeah.
Yeah, it means, overestimating your stomach's capacity when you see something that looks good.
Right. That's the Hebrew expression, Einaim gdolot, big eyes. It's shortened from that, I guess. Yeah. That's interesting. That could be also that again, I love these kind of things, but I need like a regular library. I don't know how much is online today, and I'm also not up to date, but you look to see the expression Einaim gdolot. Where is that from? Yiddish? Is that sometimes expressions in Hebrew come from Yiddish, or they come from Arabic, or all sorts of things. Yeah. Okay. Anything else on this section? Okay, well, our resident reader of rabbinic text joined us, so I'm going to ask Dan. I should have warned you before, and this is a little bit long, a little bit complicated. The idea here for me is to take in that nobody's saying, I'm not saying that Tosefta here. Tosefta is a collection of traditions from the first 2-3 centuries of the Common Era. It's parallel. It's from the same time as the Mishnah, but the Mishnah is canonical, and got canonical status in the Tosefta, which means additional, or alternative. It can also mean alternative. Has versions that are sometimes mentioned in the Talmud, quoted as Braitot, as a Braita, an outside tradition outside of the Mishnah. Much of it is in the Mishnah as well, and some of it is unique. But this gives us a feeling for at least one example of who were the Pharisees who became the sages of the Talmud. One view of what table etiquette looks like, for us to kind of compare to what came before in ancient Egyptian, Book of Proverbs, Ben Sirah. Okay, take it away, Dan. Tosefta Brachot.
What is the order of a meal? Guests come in and sit down on top of benches and on top of soft seats until all guests come in. After all guests came in, and they, that is the servants, have given them water to wash hands, every one of them washes one hand. When they, that is the servants, poured them a cup of wine, each one of the guests makes a bracha for the wine himself. When the servants brought them appetizers, each one of the guests makes a bracha for the appetizers himself. After the guests have gotten up from their temporary seats and moved to the main meeting hall and reclined on sofas, the servants gave them water to wash their hands again. Even though he already washed one hand, still he has to wash both of his hands again. After the servants poured them a cup of wine again, even though he already made a bracha on the first cup of wine, he makes another bracha on the second cup of wine. After the servants brought in front of them more appetizers, even though he already made a bracha on the first set of appetizers, he makes a new bracha on the second set. But this time, one person makes a bracha for all of them. A person who comes late after 3 appetizers have been served does not have permission to enter the dining hall.
So let's take a break right now, okay? Quite a different approach, right? What would you say is the most common thing that's happening here?
A lot of brachas, a lot of drinking.
And a lot of hand washing.
Yeah.
Look how prominent hand washing is. And that's a really interesting thing. And I know that studies have been written about the hand washing thing, this attempt to preserve some semblance of tahara, of purity, and tuma, and impurity in post-temple periods, right? So you don't have to go to the mikveh to immerse yourself in the living waters, but you do the hands. And many people know from a traditional point of view, people that eat bread, they don't necessarily have to wash their hands before eating other things in a ceremonial fashion. This is not talking about hand washing for hygienic hand washing. They could overlap, but this is even if your hands are absolutely clean with soap and water, you still have to do this ceremonial washing, and that's how it happens today for food, certainly for bread, and also for prayer.
Very OCD.
So Sasha said it's reminiscent of the Seder. Les says reminiscent of OCD, or is OCD. Yeah, there is a cultural OCD here. Les very much so, which is reminiscent of the purity and impurity laws. When Sasha says it's like the Seder, yeah, for those that keep the Seder in the traditional way, this is very, very similar because that takes a picture of something that was preserved, and yet it was only preserved for so many Jews, not for Orthodox Jews, but that hand washing, and the different things and the dipping things, that comes from a regular meal of well-to-do people, which we're imitating. Did everybody do this the way this is described here? I am under no illusions that's the case, but this is kind of the ideal, I think, the ideal meal of relatively aristocratic rabbis or people that can afford to have this kind, can afford to have servants, can afford to have wine, and can afford to have 2 different rooms, and can afford to say, if you came late, you don't get to come in. Right? You come late, you snooze, you lose. Okay, so that's the
It's
first
like the opera. If you come in the middle of the first act, you don't get seated until intermission.
There it is. Who knew the opera they keep halacha? Yes, Les.
The reason I brought up OCD is it's really ritualized repetition, always the same, following a script in your mind. But that's what the first thing I thought of.
Yeah. Okay. All right, go on, Dan.
Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, there was a great custom in Yerushalayim. The house owners would hang a towel above the door. While the towel is hanging, guests can come in. After the towel has been removed, guests are not permitted to come in anymore. And there was another custom in Yerushalayim. The house owners would give over the responsibility for a meal to a butcher, a caterer. If something went wrong during the meal, they would punish the butcher monetarily. Everything according to the honor of the owner, the host, and everything according to the honor of the guests.
So a lot of this was halacha, what we consider to be regular halacha. You do this, you do that, you are permitted, not permitted. But then we get to this thing, everything according to the honor of the guests. that's already that's the wisdom side of this. It's very, very subjective. Very subjective. I can remember learning the halachot of mishloach manot when I was in yeshiva of sending gifts, food gifts to your friends for on Purim, and how there too you're supposed to send not according to your situation, but according to who you're sending it to. So if you are a person of lowly means sending to a wealthy person, you've got to send something which is, like an expensive bottle of scotch. That's how it was told to me at the time. You have to spend an expensive bottle of scotch and some rare kind of gourmet food kind of a thing, as opposed to if you're a wealthy person sharing your mishloach manot with somebody poor, you don't send the stuff that you would send to the person who's living in the villa next door, but you send to the people living in the tenements. What's appropriate to them. That's kind of and that came halacha, but here it said more, and I think in a wisdom kind of view. Really, it's kind of saying use your heads. Let's look at the last part.
This law has been taught in the laws of the meal. A person who goes out of the dining room to relieve himself, when he goes back to the table, he washes one hand. A person who goes out of the dining room to speak to his friend and makes a long interruption by talking for a long time, when he goes back to the table, he washes both of his hands. Where does he wash them? He comes back to the table, sits down in this place, and washes his hands, and with which he washed his hands to the waiter, who shows it to the other guests who are sitting together with him in the dining room.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to debate exactly the difference between going to the bathroom, relieving oneself, and talking outside. To me, that's less the point. The point is that it was highly, highly ritualized, regulated. And I'm not saying that the Talmudic literature in the widest sense, the literature of the first 5-6 centuries in the land of Israel and in Babylonia, doesn't have a section which is parallel to Ben Sirah. There are multiple sections all over the place, but this was a nice piece that we could chew on. A bite of rabbinic literature, which does show a different aspect of it that we don't find in the biblical literature. This getting into exact details and the emphasis put on different things. There are texts about eating fast and eating standing up and eating in the marketplace. One would have to collect them from different places, and they have been collected by various books over the centuries. But I wanted to bring an example of a solid piece literary unit. Okay, comments or reactions?
Even though it's a ritual, I would think that going to the bathroom, you should wash both hands, and talking to someone, you should wash one hand.
Good. There's, in a traditional text, there's the text itself, and then there's Rashi in the imprint, and in Talmud there's Tosafot. If we were doing one today, we'd have Rashi and we'd have Richard.
Yeah.
Rabbeinu Richard, our Rabbi Richard. Okay. All right. To me, this is a kind of a pause in this has been today, a pause in our trending through Proverbs to maybe think a little bit about how does wisdom literature, how has it worked in history? How would we might use it today? In what ways? Les raises a good point. Nobody wants to be told what to do, especially in these kinds of things, yet we do tell people to do about all different kinds of things. The whole genre of food literature, on one hand, the regulation of diets and the amount of books about that. On the other hand, cookbooks. There's literature is connected to food hugely, and yeah. Anyway, I'm going to assume that not in my career, in my lifetime, that I'll be creating some sort of mini course in this, but who knows? And besides, I still owe Richard the mini course on dogs and pets in the Jewish tradition. It'll come one day, Richard.
I'm waiting for that.
You're waiting. Okay. All right, folks. Thank you for being here. Thanks for everything, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Madalena.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.